Animal Adventures, Chapter 4, Wolves. Early one spring, Laura's family loaded up a covered wagon. They left the big woods far behind. Pa built a house on the Kansas prairie where there were hardly any trees at all. One afternoon, Pa rode off on his horse, Patty, to see what he could see. There was plenty of meat in the house, so he didn't take his gun. All that day, Jack acted strange. He walked up and down, looking worried. He wrinkled his nose at the wind, and the hair on his neck stood on end. "What's the matter with Jack?" Laura asked Ma. Jack looked up at Ma, but he couldn't say anything. Ma gazed across the waving prairie grass all around them. She didn't see anything unusual. "Likely it isn't anything, Laura," she said, but toward nightfall Patty appeared, running hard. Pa was leaning almost flat on her neck. Patty's black coat was streaked with sweat and foam. Pa would never ride a horse so hard unless something was wrong. "What's the matter, Charles?" Ma called. Pa breathed a long breath. "I was afraid the wolves would beat me here, but I see everything's all right," he said. "Wolves!" Ma cried. "What wolves?" "Everything's all right, Caroline," said Pa. But he had a frightening story to tell. 50 wolves, Caroline, the biggest wolves I ever saw." The sun had gone down and a shadow came over the prairie. Pa said, "I'll tell you about it later." Pa let Pat and Patty drink from Ma's wash tub, which was ready for the next morning's washing. He didn't want to risk taking them down to the creek like he usually did. He rubbed down Patty's sweaty sides and legs and put the horses in the barn. Supper was ready. Laura and Mary stayed close to the campfire with baby Carrie beside them. They ate corn cakes and prairie hen while the fire flickered in the dark. Jack sat beside Laura. He picked his ears, listening. The hair lay flat on his thick neck, and he didn't growl. That meant everything was all right. His teeth showed a little, but that was because he was a bulldog. Laura and Mary listened while Pa told Ma about the wolves. As Pa was loping home on Patty, a pack of wolves had appeared out of a little hollow. They were all around Pa in a second. "It was a big pack," Pa said. 50 wolves, the biggest ones I ever saw in my life. Must be what they call buffalo wolves. The leader stood 3 feet at the shoulder. I tell you, my hair stood straight on end. "And you didn't have your gun," Ma said. "I thought of that, but my gun would have been no use if I'd had it. You can't fight 50 wolves with one gun, and Patty couldn't outrun them." "What did you do?" Ma asked. "Nothing. Patty tried to run," Pa said, "but I knew if she even started, those wolves would be on us in a minute, pulling us down, so I held her to a walk." "Goodness, Charles!" Ma gasped, but the wolves hadn't paid any attention to Pa. "They must have just made a kill and eaten all they could," he said. The wolves had trotted along beside Pa and Patty, jumping and playing like a pack of dogs. Finally, they turned aside and headed down a path toward the creek. As soon as they were gone, Pa let Patty go. She headed straight for home, across the prairie. She couldn't have run faster if I'd been cutting into her with a rawhide whip. Pa had worried that the wolves might be heading for the house, but they were nowhere to be seen. "All's well that ends well," Pa said. "Those wolves are miles from here by now." Jack walked around the campfire. He stood still to smell the air and listen. Once more the hair rose on his neck. Ma said it was bedtime for little girls. Not even baby Carrie was sleepy yet, but Ma took them all into the house. Laura lay in her little bed, wide awake. She could smell Pa's tobacco smoke coming in from outside. After a long time, Ma and Pa came in and very quietly went to bed, but still Laura couldn't sleep. She strained her eyes in the dark to watch Jack. He lay across the doorway. There was no door. Pa hadn't had time to build one yet. There was only a quilt hung across the open space. Laura couldn't tell if the hair was still standing up on Jack's neck, but she could see that his chin wasn't resting on his paws. His head was up, listening. Suddenly, she was sitting straight up in bed. She had been asleep. Pa stood in the moonlight at the window. He had his gun right in Laura's ear. A wolf howled. She scooted away from the wall. The wolf was on the other side of it. Laura was too scared to make a sound. At the doorway, Jack growled and bared his teeth. "Be still, Jack," Pa said. Terrible howls curled around the house. Laura rose out of bed. Pa turned to look at her. "Want to see them, Laura?" he whispered. Laura nodded. Pa leaned his gun against the wall and lifted her up to the window. There, beneath the moon, sat a half circle of wolves. They looked at Laura in the window, and she looked at them. She had never seen such big wolves. The biggest wolf was taller than she was. Everything about him was big. His pointed ears, his mouth with the tongue hanging out, his two front paws side by side. His coat was shaggy gray and his eyes were glittering green. "He's awful big," Laura whispered. "Yes, and see how his coat shines," Pa said softly. The moonlight made little glitters in the edges of the shaggy fur. They're in a ring clear around the house, Pa whispered. He and Laura moved to the other window. There, sure enough, was the other half of the circle of wolves. Laura could hear their breathing. Pa went back to the first window. Laura followed him. They were just in time to see the big wolf lift his nose till it pointed straight at the sky. He gave a long, wailing howl at the moon. All around the house, the circle of wolves pointed their noses at the sky and answered him. Their howls shuddered through the house. "Now go back to bed, little half-pint," Pa said. "Jack and I will take care of you all." Laura crawled back in bed, but for a long time she did not sleep. She listened to the breathing of the wolves on the other side of the wall. She could hear their claws scratching the ground. A nose snuffled at the crack in the long wall. The big gray leader howled again, and the others answered him. Jack never stopped pacing up and down the quilt that hung in the doorway. He didn't like those wolves. He showed them his sharp, fierce teeth. They could howl all they wanted, but Jack and Pa would not let them in.